Thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs and this is my review of the Fujifilm X-T50, a mid-range mirrorless camera aimed at photographers who want the core quality and style of the higher-end X-T5, but are happy to trade some features for a smaller, lighter and more affordable body. Headline features include the latest 40-megapixel X-Trans 5 sensor and X-Processor 5 with their related upgrades to autofocus, power consumption and movie quality, coupled with built-in stabilization, or IBIS for short, and the debut of a new film simulation dial, all packed into the smallest body in the series that sports an interchangeable lens mount. Announced in May 2024, the X-T50 comes 5 years after the X-T30 and 2.5 years after the mildly updated X-T30 Mark II version. Note there was no X-T40, so that makes the X-T50 the official successor to the X-T30 models, although some regions will continue to sell the older versions as a cheaper option. The initial body price of $1,400 or £1,300 is comfortably higher than the current $1,000 or £800 price of the X-T30 Mark II, but as you'll discover, Fujifilm is pitching it more as a mini X-T5, which retails at around $300 to $400 more, although do look out for discounts as that camera is now getting on for 18 months older. Kits are also available with the new XF16-50 zoom lens for $1,800 or £1,650, and I've got a separate review of that if you're interested. So in this review, I'll detail not just the upgrades over the previous X-T30s, but also the differences between it and the X-T5 to help you decide which camera is going to be best for you. I tested a final production model running final firmware. And since we've seen this sensor and processor combination on several previous models, I'm going to concentrate on what's new here. Now don't worry, I still have loads of new sample images for you, but for a more detailed analysis of image quality, I'll refer you to my X-T5 review for photographers. Before delving in, thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. I think most of us watching camera reviews may have a fair amount of older gear that we don't use much anymore, so why not sell it? MPB is the world's largest online platform for used photo and video gear, so if you have any kit that you're not using anymore, just head over to their website for an instant quote. For example, if you have an older X-T32 to sell, MPB could pay you £535 for one in excellent condition. I'm quoting pounds, but they also operate across Europe and the US. When selling gear to MPB, their quote also includes insurance and free collection, so there's no need to factor in delivery costs or queuing at a post office, as you might with other platforms. Once they receive and confirm the condition of your gear, you can receive the money in your account the next day. Over the years, I've bought and sold used gear on multiple platforms, but I keep returning to MPB for their simplicity, convenience, and the fact that what they offer is what you get. So why not check them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. Right, back to the review. The XT double-digit series has always been impressively compact, and the XT50 continues that tradition, measuring just 124mm wide, 84mm tall, and 49mm thick at its widest point, and that includes the grip and the eye cup. Note that the main body itself is actually only 34mm thick. Now this makes it about 6mm wider than the X-T30, 1mm taller and 2mm thicker, although unless you have them side by side, you're unlikely to notice any difference in overall size. In terms of weight, I measured the X-T50 with its battery and card at 440 grams, about 60 grams heavier than the X-T32, but now with the benefit of IBIS. This also makes it just over 100 grams lighter than the X-T5 and smaller in every dimension. To give you another idea of scale, the weight of the latest X106, which sports IBIS, is 521 grams, but of course it includes a built-in 23mm f2 lens. Meanwhile, the lightest lens in the X series so far is the XF27mm 2.8 Pancake, which weighs 84 grams. Mount this lens on the X-T50 and the combination is within a few grams of the X106, and not much thicker overall. Obviously this lens is one stop dimmer and a bit longer in focal length, but it does illustrate how the X-T50 could be a viable alternative to the X100 series for those who are willing to trade the hybrid viewfinder and fixed lens for the flexibility of an interchangeable lens mount. Indeed, I think the X-T50, not to mention other models, would really benefit from a series of updated Pancake primes. What do you think, Fujifilm? In your hands, the X-T50 unsurprisingly isn't as comfortable as the larger X-T5, but Fujifilm has greatly improved the grip over the X-T30, which now includes a ridge for your middle finger to push up against, while also allowing the shutter release and front dial to be positioned a little bit further out than before. Meanwhile, the thumb rest on the rear provides useful purchase, and I'm pleased to report that I never accidentally triggered the Q menu when picking up the camera, something that plagued my time with the X-T30, at least until its firmware update. The build quality feels solid, but like its predecessors, the X-T50 is not officially weather sealed. For that in the series, you're going to need to spend more on the larger X-T5. At first glance, the X-T50's controls look similar to the X-T30, especially on the upper right side, where you'll find the threaded shutter release with a power collar, along with recessed finger and thumb dials, both with push-to-click operation. There's a dedicated shutter speed dial which runs between 0.004 of a second and 1 second in one-stop increments, along with a separate one for the maximum flash sync speed of 1/180th of a second. 0.004 of a second remains the fastest mechanical shutter speed for this model, with the higher-end X-T5 boasting a faster 0.008 of a second mechanical shutter, but both models do offer quicker electronic shutter speeds up to 180,000th of a second using the T position on the dial. Now, as well as providing 1/3 increments for shutter speeds, the T position also allows you to dial in far longer shutter speeds than most cameras offer, beyond the usual 30-second arbitrary limit to 1, 2, 4, 8, and even 15 minutes without the need for a bulb timer or cable release. Now, this isn't a new feature for Fujifilm cameras, but it remains one of their most valuable for long exposure photographers, and I wish other manufacturers would do something similar. As before, a switch around the shutter dial flicks the X-T50 into full auto mode, and like the XS20, this includes not just scene detection, but unlocks a rather neat automatic subject detection mode for autofocus that's not available in the standard modes. Now, the auto mode does a great job at recognizing not just different scenes and conditions, but also the type of main subject and adjusting all of the settings to match. Like the XS20, it can be a little bit heavy-handed with the automatic dynamic range options, and it doesn't allow you to overrule them from the menus, but as a catch-all mode, a kind of don't panic switch, the auto mode does work very well. On the far right is a slightly recessed exposure compensation dial running between plus and minus 3 EV, with a C position which transfers control to the front finger dial after a push. Finally, there's a programmable function button. Over on the left-hand side is the first unique feature on the X-T50, which swaps the old drive mode dial for a new one that's dedicated to adjusting the film simulation. There's 8 labelled positions for standard Provia, Velvia, Astia, Classic Chrome, the latest Reala Ace, Classic Negative, Nostalgic Negative and Acros, with an on-screen guide as you turn it. A menu then allows you to choose which Acros filter you'd prefer to use, as well as programming the 3 additional custom FS positions. You can assign any of the full range of film simulations to these, including Pro Negative, Eterna, Standard Monochrome and Sepia. The new dial encourages you to explore the film simulations, which, after all, are a big selling point of the Fujifilm system. And even though they were only a button push away before, I personally found myself trying out different ones more than I would normally. I think it's a really fun addition for both those who are new or familiar with the film simulations. Of course, this now means the drive modes have moved, this time to a button on the top left of the rear surface. Like the X100 series, this presents a menu to access the burst modes, bracketing and HDR options, as well as multiple exposures, panoramas, filter effects, and finally the movie mode. The multiple exposure mode lets you combine up to 9 frames with the choice of additive, average, light or dark options. As you take each additional photo, a ghostly image of the composite so far is shown for framing guidance, and if you don't like your latest frame, you can just delete it and try again, or exit the process if desired. It's also fun to adjust the film simulation dial for different frames to mix colour and monochrome elements. Meanwhile, the panorama mode can grab a bunch of images during a choice of sweeps before then stitching them in camera. As with previous Fujifilm cameras, I've experienced highly varied results with the stitching. If the scene is complex, then any errors can be effectively hidden, but once you have a nice clean horizon, be it the sea or perhaps a ridge, I often find alignment issues. Your mileage will vary. Fujifilm fans may also notice the button to the right of the viewfinder has now become dedicated to AF on, while a new one above the tiny joystick now covers auto exposure lock. As before, there's no cross keys, with most navigation being performed by the clickable joystick or the touchscreen interface. Again, the most popular settings are accessed via the Q menu with a push of the button on the thumb rest. Oh, and the focusing mode is set by a dial in the front corner of the camera. Moving on to composition, the X-T50 shares the same size 3-inch 3x2 shaped screen as before, but now with a slightly higher 1.84 million dots. As before, this can be angled down by about 45 degrees or up by 90 degrees for more comfortable framing at high or low angles. It lacks the additional sideways tilt of the X-T5 screen, and both of those cameras are also unable to face their screens forward, so if you're after a fully articulated flip screen, perhaps for vlogging, you're going to need either the XH or XS series. Meanwhile, the electronic viewfinder appears to be the same as the X-T30's, employing a 2.36 million dot OLED panel with 0.62 times magnification. Now, while it would have been nice to have a high resolution panel or larger magnification, both of these are step-ups that were available on the X-T5, while the XH series continues to enjoy the most detailed viewfinders in the series. As before, both the battery and card are housed in the same compartment under the camera, with the X-T50 employing the same NP-W126S pack as its predecessors, and again the X100 series. While the less power-hungry X Processor 5 may squeeze more out of it than the previous generation, it does remain quite a small battery which can run short during a full days of photography, especially if you include a lot of video or use continuous IBIS stabilization. So either carry a spare or a USB power bank to top it up. This is another benefit of the X-T5, which can accommodate the larger NP-W235 pack, but this in turn makes that camera bigger and heavier. So like the X100 series, the smaller battery was chosen to keep this particular body size as compact as possible. Ultimately, it is what it is. Another compromise of a small body is only having room for a single SD memory card slot, again like the X-T30s and X100s. This is yet another step up for the X-T5, which can accommodate 2 card slots and more conveniently in the grip side too. On the plus side though, Fujifilm has at least upgraded the X-T50's card slot to support UHS-2 card speeds, in theory allowing the buffer to flush more quickly after a burst. To find out, I fired off a burst of uncompressed RAW files which work at around 87 meg each, using the top quoted mechanical speed of 8 frames per second. I managed 22 frames in 2.69 seconds, and that works out at a rate of 8.2 frames per second, before the camera then slowed to 3 frames per second. The buffer then took just under 8 seconds to fully write onto a fast UHS-2 card. These figures essentially match what I measured for the X-T5 when shooting at the same speed, with both cameras falling behind the XH2 on bursts, not just in terms of the buffer size, but also the potential for faster write speeds onto CF Express cards. That said, you only really notice when shooting bursts of RAW files. Switch the camera over to JPEG and the bursts grow in size while write times almost disappear. Plus, faster bursts are possible with the electronic shutter up to 13 frames per second with no crop, or up to 20 frames per second with a 1.29 times crop. Those files work out at 24 megapixels each. The X-T50 also inherits a pre-burst mode, which exploits the electronic shutter to keep a rolling buffer of frames as you half press the shutter. Then when you fully push it down, it commits the most recent ones to memory before then continuing the burst. In my test, the X-T50 buffered about half a second's worth of action, which doesn't sound like much, but is generally enough to ensure that you do catch the moment that, say, a bird takes flight or a player makes contact in a sport. In terms of ports, a door on the left-hand side opens to reveal a 3.5mm microphone jack, a welcome upgrade over the 2.5mm jack on the X-T30, along with USB-C and micro HDMI. You'll notice unlike the X-T5 there's no dedicated headphone jack, but it is possible to connect certain earphones to the USB-C port. Like earlier models though, it can be pretty fussy. For example, the X-T50 wouldn't drive my USB-C Apple AirPods, I think due to a D2A issue, but Fujifilm considerately bundles a compatible adapter which lets you connect any 3.5mm earphones. Just don't lose it. Battery can be charged over USB-C, and like recent Fujifilm bodies, the port also allows the camera to double up as a standard webcam. Fujifilm says that this supports 4K streaming, but like the X106 when I tried it in YouTube Live, it forced the camera into 1080-60p only. Maybe other apps or services would allow higher resolutions though. The X-T50 also supports Frame I/O for uploading files directly to the cloud for backup or collaborative work. You'll also notice an option in the menus to connect to Instax printers, but this is only for the old discontinued Wi-Fi models. Sadly and bizarrely, the most recent Fujifilm cameras still won't talk to the latest Instax printers, which now use Bluetooth only, despite the earlier XS10 proving it was possible. Come on Fujifilm, don't you want to sell more of those Instax cartridges? And finally, atop the viewfinder head are a standard hot shoe and a pop-up flash that's triggered by a lever around the film simulation dial. When comparing the X-T50 against the X-T5, it's important to remember that the X-T5 doesn't have a pop-up flash. Okay, now onto the sensor, with the X-T50 unsurprisingly inheriting the 40MP X-Trans V and X-Processor 5 combination of the X-H2, X-T5 and X106. As such, you're not only getting a boost in resolution over the previous 26MP versions, but also the improved autofocus, subject detection, and lower power consumption of the latest image processor. Just briefly, here's a standard test shot taken with the X-T50 and the new XF16-50 kit zoom launched alongside it, and under good conditions you'll enjoy some of the most detailed images from any APS-C camera. Now I've got loads of new sample images to share in a moment, but again, if you're after a detailed analysis of noise, dynamic range and raw performance, check out my X-H2 and X-T5 reviews, as the core image quality and file options are essentially the same. I will show you some autofocus tests with a new kit zoom though, here at 16mm f2.8, where you'll see the subject snap into focus without any fuss. And now at 50mm f4.8, where again refocusing between the bottle and the wall are pretty swift without any issues. The X-Processor 5 also equips the X-T50 with a subject detection menu, allowing you to manually select between animals, birds, cars, bikes, planes or trains. Meanwhile, the human face and eye detection remains on a separate menu, with the most recent selection overriding the last one. Like the XS20 before it though, I was disappointed that the auto subject selection mode is only available when the camera is set to full auto exposures. Here it is in action, and I want you to keep an eye on the white icon on the left of the grey bar at the bottom. Now these clips were all recorded in full auto mode, where you'll see the X-T50 switching between cars, bikes, human eyes, birds and animals, even with only a brief glance at them. Now it's not 100% accurate, but it's close enough to be a really viable option, rather than having to manually select the desired type of subject. So please Fujifilm, add auto subject detection to all of your cameras, and make sure that it's also available outside of full auto mode, as it just works really well. Moving on, one of the biggest upgrades on the X-T50 over its predecessors is having built-in sensor shift stabilization, or IBIS for short. Once they figured out how to squeeze it into the X106, it was inevitable that they'd include it across the X range, although it doesn't diminish the engineering achievement given the body size here. Like the X106, it's only made the X-T50 barely thicker than it was before. Here you can see the view without IBIS using the new XF16-50 at 50mm, where the image is a bit wobbly, like the X-T30 before it. But enter the menus, enable one of the continuous IBIS modes, and you can return to a much steadier view, which makes accurate framing much easier. For me, this is one of the major benefits of IBIS, especially for the X system, which has got lots of unstabilized prime lenses. But of course it also allows you to handhold much slower shutter speeds than before, and you're looking at one taken with the 16-50 at 50mm, where IBIS allowed me to capture a sharp image down to 1/10 of a second. Now on the right hand side is the same exposure, a tenth of a second, but without IBIS, where you can see the image is spoiled by camera shake. Now on the day I needed a shutter speed of 1/160th of a second to handhold a perfectly sharp result with this high resolution sensor and small body, so the IBIS was effectively giving me around 4 stops of compensation. That's far from the quoted 7 stops for me personally, but it's still extremely valuable, and as you'll see it also transforms the X-T50 for video. So moving on to the movie mode, the X-T50 unsurprisingly inherits many of the features and quality options of previous models that share the same sensor and image processor. So you can film 1080 or 4K from 24 to 60p, or 6.2K recording up to 30p. You can also choose to encode in H.264 or 265, and in a nice upgrade over the X-T30, the chance for all-eye encoding too if you prefer. Like previous models, there are some restrictions or crops though, so let's have a look at some footage that I recorded in practice. I'll start with 1080 at 25p, filmed with a 16-50 kit zoom at 35mm 5.6, and all these clips were encoded using H.265 long op. Filming 1080 at 24 to 30p, there is no crop to the horizontal field of view. But set the X-T50 to 1080 at 50 or 60p, and like the X106, you'll incur a mild 1.1 times crop to the field of view. Sorry for any wobbles in this footage, it was very windy when I was testing. Next, back to the 1080 25p clip, before switching to standard 4K at 25p, where again there's no crop between 24 and 30p. But again, when switching to 4K at 50 or 60p, you're going to incur the same mild 1.1 times crop as seen on the 1080 50p coverage. Next, let's return to 4K 25p again, before selecting the 4K HQ mode, which oversamples from 6.2K's worth of data for a more detailed image, although now only available between 24 and 30p, and perhaps more importantly with a more substantial crop of 1.23 times. And now for that 6.2K mode, which when viewed on a 4K timeline looks just like 4K HQ, again with the same 1.23 times crop and available from 24 to 30p. But the extra resolution allows you to zoom in a little bit while maintaining 4K quality, and that gives you a little extra flexibility in post, albeit not as much as an open gate mode would, which would record the full height of the sensor. As it stands, the normal 1080 and both 4K modes are available in 16:9 or wider DCI shapes, while 6.2K is 16:9 only. F-Log and F-Log2 are also available in any mode for those who want to grade, while the micro HDMI port can output 6.2K RAW video to either Atomos or Blackmagic external recorders, and that's at 24 to 30p. Before moving on, I wanted to compare the quality between those 4K modes, so here's the standard uncropped 4K at the top, with the 4K HQ mode at the bottom, but what I've done here is adjusted the lens a bit to match the field of view. Now you can better see the benefit of 4K HQ in detail. If you're into slow motion, the high-speed recording menu lets you capture at 100 to 240p and encode at 24 to 60p, with footage playing back at the set speed without sound. All modes here incur a 1.23 times crop. So let's play that 1080 25p clip again before switching to 1080 at 100p, which I've encoded at 25p for a 4 times slowdown. Notice that 1.23 times crop to the field of view. And now for 1080 at 200p, again encoded at 25p, so this time for an 8 times slowdown, although again with that fairly substantial crop. And here it is for Steven Seagal, annoyed by the tourists and taking flight. Next for video autofocus, using the 16 to 50 kit zoom at 60mm 2.8 and a single AF area in the middle. Here you can see the camera and lens pulling focus in what looks like 2 steps rather than a continuous smooth transition. It doesn't overshoot, but it does pause briefly in the middle. And now at 50mm 4.8, where there seems to be even more visible steps during each focus pull. Now this is something that I've seen when reviewing other Fujifilm cameras with this kind of close range refocusing task. It's just not something that they really excel at. So now let's try something at a more common distance. Yours truly at 50mm 4.8, using face and eye detection to find me on the frame. And I'm really relying on the autofocus here, as unless you connect an external monitor or use the phone app, you won't be able to even see if you're on the frame, let alone whether you're in focus. But luckily it's doing a better job at tracking and refocusing on me than the previous test, while also giving an idea of the potential bokeh when shooting portraits with the new kit zoom. I've got more details on that in my separate review. Now let's see how the stabilization performs for video, starting with a clip filmed at 50mm with IBIS turned off, where the footage is understandably wobbly. Next, here's the X-T50 with IBIS enabled, so you're looking at sensor shift stabilization alone here. The view has become much steadier and transformed the camera for handheld filming with unstabilized lenses, something that was tricky with the earlier X-T30. But there's more. Like many Fujifilm cameras, an optional IBIS plus DIS mode applies additional digital stabilization to further steady the image, although that's in return for a mild 1.1 times crop. And finally, here's a clip filmed with IS boost mode enabled, which is designed to lock the image in place, almost like a handheld tripod. You can see as I reposition the camera, the stabilization almost snaps into place, and it really keeps the image still at that point. I like this mode for static compositions. But if you prefer to walk while you're filming, here's how the X-T50 looks with the new kit zoom at 16mm 2.8 using IBIS alone. And it's not completely steady, but if you're careful with your steps, the footage can be fairly acceptable. Oh, and remember the screen doesn't face you, so I'm filming blind here. Next, I've enabled digital stabilization on top of IBIS, and I'd say it's not making that much difference to my walking here, certainly not the almost gimbal-like results of some rival models with their enhanced digital modes. Again though, this is no different from previous Fujifilm bodies I've tested, they're just not able to iron out my own wobbles when walking, say as well as other cameras do, but your mileage may vary. Which brings me to rolling shutters, so hold on to your lunches as I shake the camera vigorously back and forth, first in 1080 25p, where there's a little skewing, but nothing too bad. Likewise here in standard 4K at 25p, where the skewing is kept fairly low, considering the back and forth that I'm giving it here. Switch to 4K HQ mode though, and you'll see worse rolling shutter, and that's thanks to the oversampled footage having a slower readout. Now this is no different to other cameras. If you want the detail from oversampling, you're going to be paying for that with slower readout and worse rolling shutter as a result. Similarly for 6.2K footage here, which like 4K HQ reads the whole sensor, hence the worse skewing. As for recording times and overheating, you may recall the previous X-T30 only allowed 10-minute clips of 4K, and overheated in my own tests after recording 6 of them. In contrast, the X-T50 can keep recording until you run out of memory, or power, or of course if the camera overheats. With the shutdown temperature set to high, I managed a single clip of standard 4K 25p lasting 90 minutes before the battery ran out. You can see it approaching 1 hour here. I filmed indoors in the evening with the camera feeling warm at the end, but there were no temperature warnings, at least with standard 4K. Once the camera had fully cooled and I'd recharged the battery, I tried the more demanding 4K HQ mode, which managed an hour and 15 minutes before the battery ran out again. So only a little bit less than before, albeit this time with the temperature warning icon appearing during the final minutes. Your mileage will of course vary, but like the X100VI, it's great to now enjoy much longer 4K clips with reduced overheating. And now it's time for my final verdict, during which I'll show you a selection of sample images taken with the X-T50 and its new 16-50 kit zoom. As always, you can access some of the original files via my review at cameralabs.com if you'd like a closer look. The Fujifilm X-T50 becomes one of the most compelling cameras at its price point, delivering the core photo and video quality of the high-end X-T5 in a smaller, lighter and more affordable body, while retaining much of its vintage control charm. Like the X100VI, the X-T50 impressively squeezes IBIS into a compact body that's barely thicker than its predecessor, transforming its flexibility while also adopting the latest sensor and image processor. In use, I appreciated the improved grip and the addition of a dial to directly access the popular film simulations. These may have previously only been a button push away, but the dial genuinely encourages you to explore and deploy more of them. Like the XS20, the auto subject selection also works a treat, and I just wish that Fujifilm would offer it in more than just their full auto modes. I also appreciate how Fujifilm continues to offer a wide range of models to suit different owners and scenarios. The X-T50 and X-T5 are photo-first cameras, and while they can also film respectable video, hybrid shooters will be better served by the XS and XH versions with their flip screens and mode dials. If the XT approach appeals to you more though, then you have to decide whether to go for the cut-down X-T50 or the fully featured X-T5. Both share the same quality, but the X-T5 gives you a larger and more detailed viewfinder, a screen that also angles out sideways, handy when shooting in the portrait orientation, twin card slots, a faster mechanical shutter and burst speeds, along with a bigger battery, all packed into a weather-sealed body with a more comfortable grip. If you find a discounted deal, the reduced price gap can make the X-T5 seem like a no-brainer, but for some people the more compact size of the X-T50 is its unique superpower, and coupled with a pancake prime lens it also becomes a viable alternative to the X100 series, with the flexibility though of interchangeable lenses. And unlike the X-T5, remember, you're also getting a pop-up flash. And if you love the style of the X-T50 but find the new pricing too high, the older X-T32 continues to sell in some regions at a more affordable level. It might not have IBIS, the film sim dial or the latest sensor, but it remains a solid option. So tell me in the comments which is your favourite in the X series and what you'd like to see in a possible X Pro or XE model in the future. As always, thanks for watching, and thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Once again, if you have photo gear to buy, sell or trade, check them out at mpp.com or using the links below. Thanks again for watching. Bye bye.